Hi, I'm Mark David Gerson. Welcome to Stories and Reflections, where my stories are also yours. It's funny what triggers each of these podcasts and the stories I end up telling. Sometimes it's a memory, sometimes it's an anniversary of sorts. Sometimes it's something happening in my life, something current. Sometimes it's a quote in a book I'm reading or a line of dialogue from a movie, or a quote from one of my own books. And sometimes, like today, it's a cascading amalgam of a bunch of those. Cascading isn't the right word. That's because cascade suggests a reasonably orderly, if swiftly moving sequence, and that's never how these podcasts come together. It's more of a bumper car-like vortex of words, thoughts, memories, dreams, and experiences that smash into each other in a way that seems random, but isn't. One thing triggers the next, then the next, then the next, and suddenly I have a story and a reflection. Like I said, it can seem random, but it isn't, not even remotely. Rather, it's all about synchronicity. Carl Jung, who coined the term synchronicity, defined it as meaningful coincidence, the key being meaningful as opposed to random, which is how we're generally taught to think of coincidence. A meaningful coincidence. And while that's a pretty clear definition, it ignores the magic that, as I see it, underlies all synchronicity. I'm not talking about the magic wand, fairy dust, magic spell, or incantation kind of magic that takes intent to invoke. I'm talking about the magic that's always all around us. The magic that takes nothing but an open heart and an open mind to notice. The kind of magic that, by its very nature and ours, creates even more magic. And more magic. And more magic. Stories are also magic. Whether it's the stories I tell here or the stories I write, there's always some sort of synchronicity involved, some sort of magic. I've shared some of that magic with you here before, and I'm going to share more of it today. First, the magic of today's podcast, of Stories and Reflections 35. Frankly, that I've made it to 35 episodes, that's nearly 8 months' worth, is its own kind of magic. Given the technical challenges, especially in the transition from audio only to video 26 episodes ago, I'd say it's also a miracle. It's also a miracle that I keep finding things to talk about and stories to tell. It's certainly a miracle for me when you consider that just about every week, once I've finished recording that week's podcast, I have no idea what I can possibly come up with next. Some weeks, I even wonder whether I've storied myself out. Last week was one of those weeks. Once I finished recording Driving Miracles, I drew a blank. Had I finally run out of stories? Was it time to retire Stories and Reflections? Then the bumper car vortex magic started to happen. First, it was a quote from Never Was, a 2005 film about the power of stories. Back when I first saw the movie over a decade ago, I'd pulled a quote from it to use on one of my writing inspiration memes. The quote goes like this: "Sometimes the story finds the storyteller, not the other way around." And I was reminded of it a couple of weeks ago when I posted the meme to my social media accounts. If you're watching this on video, you'll see it up on your screen. If not, scroll through any of my social media accounts and you'll probably see it there. Now, it's not surprising that the quote has always resonated. When it comes to my fiction, I've never gone looking for my stories. They always seem to come looking for me. In fact, that's true as well for at least some of my nonfiction. The quote also supports something I repeat in all my classes and workshops, and all my books for writers, and it's something I've repeated here too, often. That's that my stories are smarter than I am. I kept coming back to the quote after I scheduled the meme for posting. There was just something about it that wouldn't let go. That something turned out to be one of my books, one of the stories that came looking for me. The Bard of Bryn Dune, the unexpected fourth book in what until then had been, at least to my mind, the complete Quintana trilogy. The Bard of Bryn Dune is why the series is no longer called the Quintana trilogy. Now it's the Legend of Quintana. You can't have a 4-book trilogy. Okay, I said, I'll tell the Bard of Bryn Dune story for Stories and Reflections 35. And I will, as soon as I share some more synchronicity. A few days later, I opened one of my social media accounts. Facebook, Instagram, something else, I don't remember. What I do remember is coming across a video I posted 5 years ago, on August 19th, 2021, announcing the publication of, you guessed it, The Bard of Bryn Dune. I don't even know how or why that video would have shown up. 5-year-old reels just don't. And when I went looking for it just now, I couldn't find it. Synchronicity. Magic. For some reason, coming across that reel triggered another quote memory. This one from the Cornelia Funke fantasy novel, Inkspell. It goes like this. Stories never really end, even if the books like to pretend they do. Stories always go on. That Inkspell quote also has a particular relevance to the Bard of Bryn Dune story. In fact, one of that book's taglines is, "The story never ends." Synchronicity. Magic. By then, I was fairly certain I had my topic for this week's podcast. I would share the unlikely story of how the Bard of Bryn Dune came to be. Fairly certain, but not 100% certain. I was curious about Never Was. With a quote that relevant, not only to the Bard of Bryn Dune but to pretty much all my stories, maybe I needed to watch the film again, especially as I had no conscious memory at all of what it was about. Never Was, written and directed by Joshua Michael Stern and featuring Ian McKellen, Aaron Eckhart, Nick Nolte, William Hurt, and Jessica Lange, so a pretty impressive cast, tells the story of psychiatrist Zach Riley and his relationship with his father, author of a renowned children's book that features the young Zach as its hero. It also deals with Zach's relationship with the book itself and with the boundary between imagination and so-called objective reality. More than that, though, was the confirmation I got about using the Bard of Bryn Dune's conception story for this week's podcast. One of the first lines in the film, in a voiceover spoken by Ian McKellen as the character Gabriel, was the final validation I needed. Stories are living things, he says, given to turns unpredictable. More synchronicity, more magic. That's because in the Quintana saga as I'd written it, and as I thought, concluded with the third installment in the trilogy, the Bard of Bryn Dune's appearance was entirely unpredictable. Here's what happened. In 2013, when I finished writing The Sun Quest, the third book in what I was then calling the Quintana trilogy, I considered the story complete. The 3 generations of bards had lived their journeys. The antagonist who had followed them through the trio of books had experienced his comeuppance, and there was no more story to tell. Whatever else I would write in the years ahead, it wouldn't take place in Quintana, and it likely wouldn't be fiction. The second part of that assumption would be proven wrong only 2 years later with the emergence of my novel, Sarah's Year. I share the story of how that book came to be in Stories and Reflections 6. It would take another 4 years for the first part of my assumption to be proven wrong. So now it's February 2019. I'm living in Portland, and I awake one gray morning to the intuitive certainty that there's more to my Quintana saga. I shake my head and turn over. What else can there be to say? And who would even say it? The Star Quest's main character is a daughter of the Moon Quest's protagonist, and the Sun Quest's main character is her son Ben, but Ben is childless. So again, where can the story possibly go, and with whom? But that intuitive certainty is insistent. As insistent as is the Tikon Dreamwalker, Nan, in the Moon Quest's prologue, when she tells the elderly Toshar that it's time for him to write his story, to fix the Moon Quest on parchment. I tried to resist, Toshar recounts, to shut Nan's words from my heart, to return to the dreamless sleep that preceded her appearance. but Tikhon speak only what we know in our hearts to be true, and my heart would not close to her, even as my mind longed to. Maybe that intuitive certainty I'm feeling is non. If that's the case, it's as pointless for me to resist as it was for Toshar. Still, whether it's non, my muse, or something else, I'm doubtful. And to prove that whatever it is wrong, I decide to write an opening scene to this nameless and likely pointless fourth Quintana installment. As with all my books, I have no opening scene in mind. How can I when I haven't the remotest clue what this alleged fourth story is? So as I do with all my books, I place my fingers on the keyboard, take a deep breath, and listen. Then I write what I hear from whatever deep inner place all my stories originate. The scene that unfolds on my screen involves two new characters. Well, new to me in that they're not present in any of the three existing Quintana stories. Those characters are Kamala and her young son, Pira. And it takes place in a setting just as unfamiliar. A nameless village in a desert wasteland known as the Morgen. In the scene, Kamala is telling Pira a bedtime story, a tale from Quintana's long ago past, which at least to my still skeptical conscious mind, explains the unknown characters, though not their alien setting. The story she's telling is a Sun Quest, and it's Pira's favorite. The end, she pronounces when she's finished, certain Pira is already asleep. He has always fallen asleep long before she reaches the end. This time, though, he's still awake. More than that, he's shaking his head vehemently. No, he argues, it isn't the end. Kamala counters that it's the only ending there is, one that, as with the Sun Quest story itself, has been passed down through the generations. But he's adamant, and he reminds her of something a character in another tale of the olden days tells another young man. There's more to every story, Pira recites. Tell me how it continues. He pauses for effect, then asks his mother, Isn't that what Yulisha tells Toshar in the Moon Quest? After I type those words, my fingers hover over the keyboard in amazement. Shock, really. Is this fictional stranger talking to me as much as to his mother? Is this young boy confirming what I sensed a few hours ago? In that moment, I realize that that's exactly what has happened. Non, my muse, my intuition, whatever it was right. There is more to the story, to the Quintana story. Just because I don't yet know what it is, doesn't mean it isn't there. The story didn't end, because the story can't end. So I lower my fingers to the keyboard, take another deep breath, and again, listen. And again, from whatever deep inner place all my stories originate, I continue. I'd like to be able to say that it was smooth sailing from that day forward, that the book wrote itself through me with magical ease. It wasn't, and it didn't. Rather, it wasn't, and I didn't let it. Control is about lack of trust, and I was too busy not trusting for that ease to be possible. I struggled to trust that the story knew best, and I struggled to trust that I had the skill to tell it, as it demanded to be told, from 7 different points of view, 6 of them in the first person. I'm embarrassed to admit how many times I meditated, used kinesthetic muscle testing, and dialogued with my muse and with the story itself, as I second-guessed what I knew in my heart to be true. If I got out of my own way, abandoned all attempts at control, and let the story tell itself through me as it deemed best, all would be well. In the end, I did surrender, as I always ultimately do. And when the first reviews and reader comments began to trickle in for the Bard of Bryndoon, the book was universally lauded as my best to date. And by then, the line from Cornelia Funke's Inkspell had again proven itself, the line about stories never really ending. Because I now knew there would be 2 more, at least 2 more Quintana stories after this one. The Lost Horse of Bryndoon and The Sorcerer of Bryndoon. I say at least 2 more, because a writer friend of mine, one who's very intuitive in her own right, keeps insisting that the final Katana saga will comprise 16 books. I can't even go there. Stories are living things, Gabriel says in Never Was. Given that, and this is my addition, it's best to get out of their way and let them tell themselves the way they know best. Or to borrow another line from Never Was, this one spoken by the character Maggie, don't ask questions, just follow me. Maybe it's time for me to follow Maggie's advice, at least as it applies to the Lost Horse of Bryndoon. I started writing Lost Horse nearly 5 years ago, in February 2022, and as creatively challenging as A Bard of Bryndoon was, with its 7 points of view, Lost Horse is even more so, with its 10 points of view at last count. Because of that, and for other story-related reasons, I've been at least as doubtful and insecure about this manuscript and process as I was about its predecessor. That doubt and insecurity is one of the reasons the manuscript is still unfinished. But it's only one. Sometimes, as I learned with the Moon Quest, it isn't fear or some other form of writer's block that holds us back from continuing. Sometimes we need time and life experience in order to grow into the continuing. And that's as true with life projects as it is with writing projects. Is it time? Have I gained the necessary life experience? To be honest, even as I ask the question, I'm not sure. On one hand, I hate having this unfinished project hanging over me. On the other hand, as I put it in Stories and Reflections 34, the temptation to push, to force, to make things happen is always strong. The challenge and opportunity is to resist that knee-jerk temptation and to rely instead on discernment, intuition, to alert me when to act, when to allow, and when to find the right balance between the two. Then there's the matter of time. I was about to complain that I don't have enough when I remembered my experience 8 years ago with the Star Quest. After 2 failed attempts to finish a first draft, the first one dating back a decade, I knew it was time to try again, and this time to succeed. Problem was, I had an exhausting full-time job that I hated, and I was nearly broke. Now, I told myself, not from an ego mind place, but from a place of highest wisdom, now at a time when I have no time, I have to make time. And somehow I did. Not only did I find the time completing a first draft 8 months later, but the energy of my commitment also turned my finances around. Which brings me back full circle to where I began today, with synchronicity and with magic. It's no accident or random coincidence that my muse, the forces of the universe, or Katana's Nan, the Tikon dreamwalker who got the Moon Quest going, threw synchronicities and a bunch of magic at me to get me to talk about the Bard of Bryndoon today. Stories are mightier than any wizardry, Hurrah says toward the end of the Bard of Bryndoon. Nothing can rival their magic. That magic shows up not only in the telling, but in the portals we pass through in both the telling and the hearing of them. So maybe it was inevitable that I would also talk about the Lost Horse of Bryndoon today, along with its seemingly chronically unfinished status. But it wasn't planned, at least not consciously. Never Was ends as it begins, with a voiceover from Gabriel, as played by Ian McKellen. Once again, he says, I live as I dreamed. In many ways, my Katana world is as important to me as Gabriel's Never Was is to him. And telling its stories is as central to my dreams and passions as living his story is to him. In one of the Bard of Bryndoon's final scenes, Perra says, the story that opened this telling, with a bedtime fable in a faraway village, was about to complete another installment. This completion would not be a final one, for stories have no fixed endings, any more than they have fixed beginnings. All that remained for me now was to let the story carry me to its next chapter. And all that remains for me now is to do likewise. Thanks for joining me for Stories and Reflections today. I hope you found moments in my stories that touched something in yours. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And for more of my stories and help telling yours, check out my books at markdavidgerson.com or from online booksellers worldwide. Until next time, don't forget that you're a storyteller too, and keep telling your stories. The intro and outro music for today's episode is Heartwarming by Kevin MacLeod from Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons.